What happened to the Temple of Jerusalem is heartbreaking. It made headlines around the world. People are desperate. The Jews are crying. Some are crying out for help. They are sad because for a long time they worked hard, dedicated themselves, and dreamed of this temple. And after fulfilling this dream, unfortunately, the worst happened. I will tell you all the details of this story, but first I want to tell you how everything happened. From its construction until now. Are you ready? Then let's begin. The story of the Temple of Jerusalem is interesting, and it all started with a man on his knees, looking at the starry sky of Jerusalem, with tears in his eyes and a heart burning with desire. This man is David, the king chosen by God, the warrior who defeated Goliath, the leader who united Israel like never before. But despite all the victories, there was something he couldn't forget. The Ark of the Covenant still did not have a permanent place. She was in tents, in provisional shelters, while the surrounding peoples built temples of marble and gold for their false gods. Can you imagine the weight that this carried in David's heart? He wanted to give God the best, a place worthy of his presence. In the book of 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 2, David says to the prophet Nathan, "Look, I am living in a house of cedar, and the ark of God is under curtains." This phrase is so simple, but it reveals something extraordinary. David felt ashamed to live in a luxurious palace, while the ark, a symbol of the Lord's presence, remained in a fragile tabernacle. It is as if he said, "How can I rest while my God does not have a house?" David's heart burned to build a temple, a fixed and eternal place. But here comes something surprising. God said no. Do you realize the strength of that? The man after God's own heart had a holy desire, but the Lord responded through Nathan in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 5. "You shall not build me a house to dwell in." Why? Because David was a man of wars. He had shed too much blood. The temple should be built by the hands of peace. Do you know what this shows us? That not always the purest desire is what God planned for us. Sometimes He has a greater purpose, something beyond what we can understand. But God did not reject David's heart. On the contrary, He promised something extraordinary, that from his descendants would come a son who would build the temple. This promise pointed to Solomon, but also went far beyond, because ultimately it pointed to the Messiah, the true son of David. However, David did not sit back. Even without being able to build the walls, he prepared everything. He gathered stones, wood, gold, silver, iron. In 1 Chronicles 22:5 it is written, David said, "My son Solomon is still young and tender, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be magnificent in excellence, for reputation and glory in all lands. I will therefore prepare for him the necessary." What a scene! A king who does not build with his own hands, but who leaves everything ready for his son to accomplish. Now imagine Solomon ascending the throne, still young, carrying not only the responsibility of ruling, but also the grand mission of building God's house. The father's dream now became his challenge, and Solomon asked God for wisdom to accomplish this work. He began to build on Mount Moriah, the same place where Abraham had erected the altar to sacrifice Isaac, as stated in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. Do you realize how profound this is? The place of Abraham's sacrifice would become the place of God's presence among men. Nothing is by chance. Every detail was in the divine plan. The Temple of Solomon was something that still impresses humanity today. Pure gold, cedars from Lebanon, stones carved with perfection. In 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 7, it is written that neither hammer, nor axe, nor iron tool was heard in the house while it was being built. In other words, each stone was prepared before arriving at the site. Can you imagine the reverent silence of that construction site? It was not just any building, it was the house of the Lord. When the temple was finally completed, Solomon prayed a prayer that still echoes today. In 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 27, he said, "But truly God dwells on earth? Behold, the heavens and even the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house which I have built." This is awe-inspiring. The king himself recognized that no human construction could contain the Creator, but God chose to manifest His glory there. When the priests placed the ark in the Holy of Holies, the glory of the Lord filled the house to such an extent that they could not even stand. My friend, can you feel the weight of this? The temple was more than stones. It was more than gold. It was the visible symbol of God's presence among His people. From there came prayers. From there came the certainty of forgiveness. From there the people remembered that God was the center of the nation. David's desire had become a reality through Solomon's hands. But little did they know that this grand story would also go through tragedies, destructions, and new beginnings. The Temple of Solomon shone like a lighthouse for all nations. Kings and queens traveled miles to see its beauty. The Queen of Sheba herself, in 1 Kings chapter 10 verses 4 and 5, was speechless when contemplating the glory of the palace and the temple. She said that not even half had been told her. This shows the greatness of that place, but along with glory came also danger. Solomon's heart, so full of wisdom, began to stray. He married foreign women, brought idols into Israel, and gradually the people who were supposed to worship only the living God began to become corrupt. Do you realize the gravity of this? The temple was standing, radiant, but true worship was no longer in the hearts of the people. It was not gold, it was not rituals, but obedience that kept God's presence there. And without obedience, there was no glory that could withstand. The prophets began to warn. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all of them raised their voices saying, "If you do not repent, the temple will be destroyed." Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 4 records the words that echoed in Jerusalem. "Do not trust in deceptive words saying, 'The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord is this.'" Do you understand the irony? The people believed that just because the temple was there, they would be protected. But God is not impressed by stone walls. He looks at the heart. And then came the terrible day. The year was 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, besieged Jerusalem. For months the people went without food, without hope. The walls were torn down, and the temple, that glorious place that David dreamed of and Solomon built, was set on fire. In 2 Kings chapter 25 verse 9, it is written, "And he burned the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and all the great houses he burned with fire." Can you imagine the despair? The people seeing the fire consume the place where God's glory had descended. It was as if the heart of the nation was torn out before their eyes. It was not just the destruction of a building, it was the breaking of an identity. The temple was the center of spiritual life. It was the symbol of the covenant. Without it, the Jews felt like a people without a land. The sacred utensils were taken to Babylon, the priests were killed, the bronze gates were torn down. It was the end of an era. But here is something that will impact you. Even in destruction, God was fulfilling His word. The prophet Jeremiah had already warned that the people would be in exile for 70 years. Nothing was accidental. The ruin of the temple was the living proof that God does not get fooled by appearances. He does not dwell in gold and stones if the heart is empty. Imagine the exiles in Babylon sitting by the riverbanks, crying. Psalm 137 verse 1 describes this moment. "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. They hung their harps on the willows because there was no more song." The burned temple was an open wound in the people's memory. But God's faithfulness had not ended. Even in captivity, He raised men like Daniel, who remained steadfast in prayer, turning his face toward Jerusalem, even though the city was in ruins. This shows that even if the physical temple had been destroyed, God's true presence was not limited to the walls. And when the exile period ended, God moved the heart of a foreign king, Cyrus of Persia. In Ezra chapter 1, verse 2, it is written, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah." Do you perceive the extraordinary of this? A pagan king being used by God to rebuild the temple, but the reconstruction would not be easy. When the first exiles returned to Jerusalem and looked at the ruins, many wept. Solomon's temple was just a distant memory. The work began, but faced opposition, persecution, and discouragement. The surrounding peoples mocked. The Jews themselves questioned whether it was worth it. And here is where the story gains a new layer. Even destroyed, the temple would become a sign of hope, but also of spiritual battle. Before proceeding with the details of the reconstruction and the new challenges that arose, I want you to leave a comment. If you believe that God's presence is greater than any temple or human construction, write in the comments, "The Lord dwells in me." The first exiles who returned to Jerusalem found a city in ruins. Imagine walking through those silent streets where there once were songs and processions. Mount Moriah was covered with burnt stones and ashes. Where God's glory had descended, now only dust remained. But even in the midst of chaos, a small group of men rose up. Zerubbabel, a descendant of David's lineage, led the people, accompanied by the priest Joshua. They had a clear mission, to rebuild the house of the Lord. In Ezra chapter 3, verse 10, it is written that when the builders laid the foundations of the temple, the priests dressed in their robes and began to praise the Lord. Some shouted with joy, but others cried aloud, remembering the glory of Solomon's temple. Can you feel this contrast? It was like a people divided between hope and longing. The new temple was a symbol of rebirth, but it would never have the same splendor as the first. The work, however, was not simple. The neighboring peoples tried to prevent it, accused the Jews before the Persian king, sent letters and raised opponents. The construction stopped for years. The people began to focus on their own houses, neglecting the house of the Lord. It was then that God raised prophets like Haggai and Zechariah to awaken their spirits. In Haggai chapter 1, verse 4, God asks, "Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house remains desolate?" It was a call to prioritize. And do you know what is most incredible? Despite the work seeming small, God was already pointing to something greater. In Haggai chapter 2, verse 9, he declares, "The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former." This did not only mean material beauty, but the promise that one day the Messiah himself would tread that temple. The years passed and the structure was built. It didn't have the gold or the grandeur of Solomon's temple, but it had the value of perseverance. Then came Herod the Great, a cruel ruler, but who decided to expand and beautify the temple. He reconstructed almost everything, creating a gigantic complex that became one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was this temple, known as the Herod's Temple, that Jesus knew. And here comes something that will give you chills. When Jesus entered that temple, he saw the money changers, the pigeon sellers, turning the house of prayer into a marketplace. With authority, he overturned the tables and declared in Matthew chapter 21, verse 13, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of thieves." Do you realize the strength of this? The Son of God was there, in the place that symbolized the presence of his Father, and yet the hearts of the people were distant. Jesus also made it clear that the temple would not be eternal. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 2, he said, "Not one stone here will be left on another, everyone will be thrown down." This prophecy sounded impossible. The temple was gigantic, with stones weighing up to 40 tons. Who could imagine that it would fall? But Jesus' words were clear. Idolatry, hypocrisy, and rejection of the Messiah would bring destruction again. And that is exactly what happened. In the year 70 AD, Titus, a Roman general, besieged Jerusalem. The people resisted, but they were crushed. The temple was set on fire, the stones were knocked down, and the treasures were taken away. The historian Flavius Josephus reports that the fire was so intense that the temple's gold melted, flowing between the stones. To recover the precious metal, Roman soldiers tore down each stone, exactly fulfilling what Jesus had said. Not one stone was left on another. This moment was a watershed. The temple, which for centuries had been the center of Jewish faith, ceased to exist. And from that point, something extraordinary happened. God's true dwelling would no longer be a building in Jerusalem, but the hearts of those who believe in Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16, Paul declares, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you?" My friend, do you understand the impact of this? The stone temple was torn down, but God was not left without a dwelling. He began to dwell within each person who surrenders to Christ. This is so profound that it changes everything. We no longer need to travel to Jerusalem to find God's presence. He is in us. He walks with us. And before we continue to the last part of this story, where we will see how the place of the temple was transformed into the Dome of the Rock, I want to make a special request. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss any content like this. Here, each video is made to open your vision and strengthen your faith. Don't miss out. After the destruction in the year 70 AD, Jerusalem was never the same. The temple, the center of the Jewish people's identity, had become just a pile of burnt stones. But the tragedy was not yet over. In 135 AD, after a new Jewish revolt against Rome, Emperor Hadrian decided to erase any memory of that place once and for all. He forbade Jews from entering Jerusalem and built a pagan city called Aelia Capitolina on its ruins. Where once there were praises to the God of Israel, now stood statues of Roman gods. Can you imagine the pain of the people? They not only lost the temple, but were also expelled from the city that was the heart of their faith. For centuries, the Mount of the Temple remained abandoned, without the glory it once had. For the Jews, that place was memory and promise. They prayed facing Jerusalem, remembering the destroyed temple, and waiting for the day when God would restore his house. To this day in synagogues they repeat, "Next year in Jerusalem." The longing for the temple has never left the heart of Israel, but history did not stop there. In the 7th century AD, Muslim rule reached Jerusalem, and it was then that a new construction forever changed the landscape of Mount Moriah. Caliph Abd al-Malik built the famous Dome of the Rock, completed in the year 691. That building with its golden dome came to mark the place where, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad ascended to heaven. Do you see the twist? The same mountain where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, where Solomon built the temple, where God's glory descended, was now occupied by a Muslim structure. The Dome of the Rock is an impressive structure. Its golden dome shines under the Jerusalem sun, and to this day, it is one of the most recognized symbols of the Middle East. But for the Jews, that shine is a painful reminder. The temple should be there, the Holy of Holies should be there, and that is why the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall, has become the most sacred place for them. It is what remains of Herod's temple complex, where Jews gather to pray, cry, and await restoration. And do you know what is even more impressive? The Bible speaks of a future in which there will be a new temple. In Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48, there is a detailed vision of a temple yet to come, with specific measurements and the promise that God's glory will return to dwell there. This shows that the story of the temple has not ended. What we see today, the dome of the rock on the mount, is just a chapter of a story that is still being written. But while human eyes seek stones and buildings, God has already made something much greater clear. Jesus declared in John chapter 4, verse 23, "But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth." This means that the physical temple may have been destroyed, rebuilt, and replaced, but the living temple, formed by every heart given to God, remains standing. My friend, perhaps you are looking at ruins in your life. Maybe you feel that what was precious has been destroyed. But the same God who restored his people in the past continues to restore today. He does not need stones to dwell. He wants to dwell in you. The temple is no longer in Jerusalem. It is in each person who opens their heart to Jesus. If this story spoke to your heart, click like now. This helps a lot so that more people can be reached and know these extraordinary truths. Because in the end, the greatest question is, have you become God's dwelling? If the Holy Spirit dwells in you, then the glory that once filled the temple can also fill your life.